Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. The warm summer air hung heavy as dusk settled over our quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a Friday evening in late July, about 6 months ago, when my life took an unexpected and terrifying turn. At the time, I was just 17 years old, enjoying what should have been a carefree summer before my senior year of high school. As usual, I found myself at my friend Jasper's house with our other buddies. Dominic and Tyler, the four of us had been inseparable since middle school, bonding over video games, sports, and the typical teenage pursuits. Jasper's parents were often away on business trips, making his spacious home our default hangout spot. That fateful night started innocently enough. We were sprawled across Jasper's basement rec room, engrossed in a heated multiplayer battle on his massive flat-screen TV. The only sounds were the clacking of controller buttons, occasional shouts of triumph or frustration, and the muffled thump of bass from the speakers. "Oh, come on!" Tyler yelled suddenly, hurling his controller to the floor in a burst of anger after a particularly brutal defeat. The plastic cracked ominously against the hardwood. Jasper's eyes widened. "Dude, what the hell? That's my good controller!" Tyler's face immediately fell, regret replacing his momentary rage. "Shit, man. I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me." An awkward silence descended as we all stared at the damaged controller. Finally, Tyler spoke up again. "Look, I feel terrible. How about we run to Walmart and I'll buy you a new one right now?" Jasper considered for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, all right. I guess we were probably going to end up there tonight anyway." It was true. Our weekend ritual often involved late-night Walmart runs, more for the aimless entertainment than any real shopping needs. Plus, there was a Taco Bell right next door, and none of us had eaten dinner yet. "I'm down," I chimed in, my stomach growling at the thought of food. "Dominic!" He shrugged, already reaching for his shoes. "Why not? Better than losing to you jerks again." We piled into Jasper's beaten-up Honda Civic, the car groaning under our combined weight. As we pulled out of the driveway, I had no idea that this mundane errand would set in motion a chain of events that would haunt me for months to come. The drive to Walmart was uneventful, filled with our usual banter and debates about music, movies, and girls. We made our purchases quickly. A replacement controller for Jasper, and an assortment of snacks and energy drinks to fuel our planned all-nighter. Next door, at Taco Bell, we devoured our food in the parking lot, windows down to combat the stuffy summer heat. As we finished up, Tyler leaned forward from the back seat, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Hey, you guys ever hear about that new shop over on Elm Street? The one that sells those special gummies?" I tensed immediately. Despite being a fairly typical teenager in most respects, I'd always steered clear of anything drug-related. It just wasn't my scene, and I'd seen how substance abuse had torn apart some families in our community. Dominic, however, perked up with interest. "Oh yeah, I think my cousin mentioned that place. Supposed to be pretty wild stuff." Jasper looked intrigued but hesitant. "I don't know, man. My mom's home tonight, and she'd kill me if she caught us with anything like that." I was about to voice my own objections when a thought occurred to me, one that I would come to regret deeply. "What about my family's cabin?" I suggested, surprising myself. "It's only about 20 minutes from here. We could check the place out, no parents around." The words had barely left my mouth before I wished I could take them back. But it was too late. The guys latched onto the idea with enthusiasm, and before I knew it, we were pulling into the parking lot of a nondescript strip mall. Tyler hopped out of the car, a wad of cash in hand that we'd all contributed to. "Be right back," he called over his shoulder, disappearing into a shop with blacked-out windows. As we waited, a sense of unease began to settle over me. The darkened storefronts, the empty parking lot, the distant sound of a train whistle, it all felt ominous somehow, as if the night itself was trying to warn us away from the path we were choosing. Tyler returned a few minutes later, a small paper bag clutched tightly in his fist. His eyes were wide with excitement. "Got him," he announced, sliding back into the car. "Let's get out of here." As Jasper started the engine, I gave him directions to the cabin. With each mile that passed, my anxiety grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake, that we were about to cross a line we couldn't uncross. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as Jasper's car crawled up the winding driveway to my family's cabin. Towering pines loomed on either side, their branches seeming to reach out like gnarled fingers in the gloom. As we rounded the final bend, the cabin came into view, a dark silhouette against the star-studded sky. "This is it," I announced, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet car. The cabin itself was nothing special, a modest, single-story structure built by my grandfather in the 1970s. It had been modernized over the years, but still retained a rustic charm. To the right of the main building stood a weathered wooden shed where we stored ATVs and other outdoor equipment. As we exited the car, the cool night air hit me like a slap to the face. A shiver ran down my spine, and not just from the temperature drop. An inexplicable feeling of dread washed over me, as if unseen eyes were watching our every move. I scanned the tree line, my gaze lingering on the shadows between the trunks. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, a flash of something pale darting behind the shed. I blinked, and it was gone. "You okay, man?" Dominic asked, noticing my distraction. I shook my head, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired, I guess. Come on, let's head inside." The cabin's interior was exactly as I remembered it. A small living room straight ahead, a kitchenette and bunk room to the left, and a bedroom and bathroom to the right. It smelled of pine and old leather, a comforting scent that momentarily eased my nerves. As soon as the door closed behind us, Tyler produced the bag of gummies with a flourish. "Who's ready to party?" Jasper and Dominic eagerly reached for the treats, but I held back. "I think I'll pass," I said. "Someone needs to stay sober to drive us home later." The others nodded, accepting my decision without argument. As they divvied up the gummies, I busied myself turning on lights and checking that we had everything we needed for the night. About half an hour passed before the effects began to show. Dominic was the first, dissolving into fits of giggles at the slightest provocation. Jasper wasn't far behind, his eyes taking on a glassy, unfocused look as he swayed to music only he could hear. Tyler, surprisingly, seemed largely unaffected. He watched the others with an amused expression, occasionally joining in their laughter but maintaining his composure. As the night wore on, I found myself growing increasingly on edge. Every creak of the old cabin's timbers, every rustle of leaves outside sent my heart racing. I tried to rationalize my fear. It was just an unfamiliar place, just the wind, just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something felt fundamentally wrong, as if the very air around us had become charged with malevolent energy. Around 2 a.m., the initial euphoria began to wear off. Jasper stumbled into the bedroom on the right, collapsing onto the bed without even removing his shoes. Dominic sprawled across the living room couch, his snores soon filling the air. Tyler stood up, stretching languidly. "I think I'm going to go sit in the car for a bit," he announced. "Clear my head, listen to some tunes." I nodded absently, too tired to argue. As the door clicked shut behind him, I made my way to the bunk room, desperate for some rest. Lying in the darkness, I stared at the ceiling, willing sleep to come. Just as I was about to drift off, a sound jolted me back to full alertness, a soft, insistent tapping at the window, tap, tap, tap. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned my head towards the source of the noise. The window was a black void, revealing nothing of what might be lurking outside. Tap, tap, tap. Gathering my courage, I sat up, eyes straining to penetrate the darkness beyond the glass. For a moment I thought I saw something, a pale, elongated face pressed against the pane. But when I blinked, it was gone. The tapping had stopped, but my heart continued to race. I told myself it was just a branch in the wind, just my overtired mind playing tricks on me. But a part of me knew better. A part of me sensed the malevolent presence that had followed us to this isolated spot, waiting for its moment to strike. As I lay back down, my phone suddenly burst to life, the ringtone shattering the oppressive silence. With trembling hands, I answered the call. "Hello?" I whispered. "Hey, sport." My father's voice, normally a source of comfort, now sent a chill down my spine. "Saw on the trail cams you boys are down at the cabin? Just wanted to let you know I might come by in the morning to do some hunting. Could you get my bow ready?" I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Sure, Dad, I can do that. Thanks, son. See you in the morning." As the call ended, I sat frozen in place, my mind reeling. Trail cameras. My father had seen us arrive. But if that was the case, what else might those cameras have captured? With shaking legs, I forced myself out of bed. I had to warn the others, had to make sure we were all safe and accounted for. But as I reached for the doorknob, a sound from outside stopped me dead in my tracks. A low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. And then a scream, unmistakably human, unmistakably terrified. My hand froze on the doorknob, paralyzed by the inhuman sound that had shattered the night's silence. The scream that followed sent ice through my veins. It was Tyler's voice, distorted by terror and pain. Adrenaline surged through me, momentarily overriding my fear. I yanked the door open and burst into the main room of the cabin. Dominic was already on his feet, his eyes wide with confusion and alarm. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, a rhythmic thudding sound came from the front door. Someone or something was trying to get in. "Tyler?" I called out, hoping against hope that it was just our friend returning from the car. "Is that you?" The pounding stopped abruptly. For a moment silence reigned. Then a voice spoke. Tyler's voice, but wrong somehow, hollow, lifeless. "Let me in," it said, the words slithering through the cracks around the door. "It's cold out here." Every instinct in my body screamed danger. Whatever was outside, it wasn't Tyler. Not anymore. "We need to get out of here," I whispered urgently to Dominic. "Wait, Jasper. I'll grab what we need." As Dominic hurried to rouse our sleeping friend, I racked my brain for a plan. The car keys were in Tyler's pocket, wherever he was now. We were trapped. Then I remembered my father's hunting gear. The bow he'd asked me to prepare, and more importantly, the shotgun he kept locked in the bedroom closet. I sprinted for the bedroom, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, I could hear the thing outside speaking again. Its Tyler voice becoming more insistent, more angry. "Let me in." Each word was punctuated by a blow to the door, the wood groaning under the assault. I fumbled with the closet's combination lock, my sweaty fingers slipping on the dial. Come on, I muttered, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Finally, the lock clicked open. I grabbed the shotgun and a box of shells, then ran back to the main room. Jasper was awake now, barely, his eyes unfocused and confused. "What's going on?" he slurred. "No time to explain," I said, shoving shells into the shotgun with shaking hands. "We need to—" My words were cut off by an ear-splitting crack. The front door burst inward, wood splinters flying through the air. And there, silhouetted in the doorway, was a nightmare made flesh. The creature was vaguely humanoid, but grotesquely elongated. Its limbs were too long, too thin, skin pulled tight over visible bones. But it was the face that seared itself into my memory, a featureless expanse of pale, waxy flesh, save for a gaping maw filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. For a heartbeat, we all stood frozen, prey in the presence of a predator. Then the thing lunged forward with impossible speed, its clawed hands reaching for Dominic. I raised the shotgun and fired without thinking. The blast was deafening in the confined space of the cabin. The creature staggered backward, dark ichor oozing from wounds in its chest. But it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a sound, part scream, part roar, that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. "Run!" I yelled, chambering another round. "Get to the shed." Dominic and Jasper didn't need to be told twice. They bolted for the door, squeezing past the wounded but still very much alive monster. I fired again, the recoil slamming into my shoulder, and then turned to follow my friends. The cool night air hit me like a slap as I sprinted across the yard. Behind me, I could hear the creature recovering, its inhuman shrieks spurring me to run faster than I ever had before. The shed loomed ahead, a dark haven that promised some measure of safety. Dominic reached it first, wrenching the door open. Jasper was right behind him. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing was gaining on me, moving with a fluid grace that belied its grotesque form. In the moonlight, I could see its face more clearly now, or rather, the lack of a face. Where eyes should have been, there were only sunken hollows, somehow more terrifying than any gaze could have been. I dove through the shed door, Dominic slamming it shut behind me. We pressed our bodies against it, feeling the impact as the creature slammed into the other side. "What is that thing?" Jasper whimpered, huddled in a corner. I shook my head, gasping for breath. "I don't know, but we need to find a way out of here." The pounding on the door intensified. Wood splintered. It was only a matter of time before our barricade gave way. As I frantically searched the shed for anything we could use as a weapon, my eyes fell on a dusty tarp in the corner, and beneath it the outline of something that might just save our lives. "The ATV," I breathed. "If we can get it started," understanding dawned in Dominic's eyes. "A chance to outrun that, whatever it is," I nodded grimly. "It's our only shot." As we moved to uncover the vehicle, the creature outside let out another bone-chilling cry. But this time, there was something else mixed in with the inhuman shriek. A word, spoken in Tyler's voice, dripping with malice. "Found you!" The old ATV groaned to life beneath me, its engine sputtering and coughing like an ancient beast roused from slumber. Jasper and Dominic clung to me desperately, their fingers digging into my sides as I revved the throttle. "Hold on!" I shouted over the engine's roar, and then we were moving. The shed's wooden door exploded inward just as we burst through it, showering us with splinters. I caught a glimpse of the creature's grotesque form lunging towards us, its elongated arms reaching out with inhuman speed. But we were already careening down the hill, the ATV bouncing violently over the uneven terrain. The cool night air whipped past us as we plunged into the cornfield at the base of the hill. Tall stalks whipped at our faces and arms, leaving stinging welts in their wake. Behind us, I could hear the creature's unearthly shriek of frustration, followed by the sound of vegetation being torn apart as it gave chase. "It's following us," Jasper yelled, his voice tight with terror. I didn't dare look back, focusing all my attention on navigating through the maze-like rows of corn. The ATV's headlight cut a narrow swath through the darkness, barely illuminating the path ahead. Every decision had to be made in a split second, left or right, straight or turn. One wrong move could send us crashing, or worse, into the clutches of the monstrosity pursuing us. As we burst out of the cornfield and onto an old dirt road, I finally chanced a glance over my shoulder. The creature was loping after us on all fours, moving with a speed that defied its gangly frame. In the moonlight, its pale skin seemed to glow with an unholy luminescence. "It's gaining on us!" Dominic screamed, his fingers digging painfully into my ribs. I twisted the throttle as far as it would go, willing the old ATV to give us more speed. The engine whined in protest, but we began to pull ahead. For a moment, I dared to hope we might outrun the thing. Then, without warning, the dirt road ended, giving way to thick underbrush. I had a split second to make a decision, try to plow through the vegetation or veer off into the woods. In that moment of hesitation, disaster struck. The ATV's front wheel caught on an exposed root, sending us into a violent spin. We were thrown clear of the vehicle, tumbling painfully across the forest floor. I landed hard on my back, the wind knocked out of me. Through a haze of pain, I saw the ATV continue its trajectory, slamming into a tree with a sickening crunch of metal. For a few seconds, all I could hear was a high-pitched ringing in my ears and the ragged sound of my own breathing. Then gradually other noises filtered in, the groans of my friends, the distant hoot of an owl, and silence. No sign of our pursuer. "Everyone okay?" I managed to croak out, pushing myself to a sitting position. "I think I broke my arm," Jasper whimpered from somewhere to my left. I'm all right," Dominic said, his voice shaky. "Where is it? Did we lose it?" As if in answer to his question, a blood-curdling howl echoed through the forest. It was close, too close. "We need to move," I said, scrambling to my feet, despite the protests of my battered body. "Can you guys walk?" Jasper and Dominic nodded, both pale and wide-eyed with fear. I helped Jasper to his feet, wincing at his sharp intake of breath as he cradled his injured arm. "Which way?" Dominic asked, scanning the dark woods around us. I looked up, trying to orient myself by the stars peeking through the canopy.
"This way," I said, pointing.
"If we can make it to the highway, maybe we can flag down a car." We set off at as quick a pace as we could manage, every snapping twig and rustling leaf sending jolts of panic through us. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees looming like silent sentinels in the gloom. More than once, I thought I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes of stumbling through the undergrowth, we came to a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated barn, its weathered boards silvered by moonlight. "Should we hide in there?" Jasper asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated. The barn offered shelter, a place to catch our breath and potentially find something to use as a weapon. But it could also be a trap, leaving us cornered if the creature found us. Before I could make a decision, a twig snapped loudly behind us. We whirled around, hearts pounding. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the creature. Its eyeless face was turned towards us, its mouth stretched in a horrific parody of a grin. "Inside now!" I yelled, shoving my friends towards the barn. We sprinted across the clearing, the sound of the creature's pounding footsteps spurring us on. I reached the barn door first, yanking it open and ushering Jasper and Dominic inside. As I moved to follow them, I felt something grab my ankle. I looked down to see a pale, elongated hand wrapped around my leg, its grip like iron. The creature's face loomed behind it, its mouth opening to reveal row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. In that moment, staring into the abyss of its maw, I was certain I was about to die. Time seemed to slow as I stared into the nightmarish face of our pursuer, its grip on my ankle unwavering. The creature's mouth gaped wider, a fetid stench washing over me. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I kicked out with my free leg, my foot connecting solidly with what passed for the thing's jaw. There was a sickening crunch, and suddenly I was free. I scrambled backwards into the barn, Dominic and Jasper slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind me. "Help me barricade it," I gasped, pushing myself to my feet. We worked frantically, dragging old farm equipment and rotting bales of hay against the door. Outside, we could hear the creature's inhuman shrieks of rage, punctuated by the sound of claws scraping against wood. "Will it hold?" Jasper asked, cradling his injured arm. I shook my head grimly. "Not for long. We need to find another way out." The interior of the barn was pitch black, save for thin slivers of moonlight peeking through gaps in the walls. The air was thick with the musty smell of old hay and animal droppings. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I could make out the vague shapes of old farming tools hanging on the walls. "Grab anything we can use as a weapon," I instructed, reaching for a rusted pitchfork. Dominic found an ancient-looking axe, while Jasper, hampered by his broken arm, managed to pick up a heavy wrench. We huddled together in the center of the barn, weapons raised, as the pounding on the door intensified. "What is that thing?" Jasper whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "But it's not going to stop until it gets us." As if to emphasize my point, there was a tremendous crash as part of the barricade gave way. A long, pale arm snaked through the gap, clawed fingers grasping at the air. "Up there," Dominic hissed, pointing to a ladder leading to a hayloft. "We might be able to get out through the roof." It was our only chance. We scrambled for the ladder, Jasper going first despite his injury. I brought up the rear, swinging the pitchfork at the creature's probing arm. There was a shriek of pain as the tines connected, and the arm withdrew. We reached the hayloft just as the barricade finally gave way completely. The creature burst into the barn, its eyeless face turning up towards us. For a moment it seemed confused, sniffing the air like a predator seeking its prey. Then, with horrifying agility, it began to scale the wall, using its long limbs to pull itself up towards our position. "The roof!" I yelled, spotting a section of rotted boards. "We can break through!" Dominic attacked the weak spot with his axe, wood splintering under each blow. Jasper and I watched the creature's ascent with growing terror. It was halfway up the wall now, moving with unnatural speed. "Hurry!" Jasper pleaded. With a final mighty swing, Dominic broke through. Cool night air rushed in through the hole. "Go!" he shouted, helping Jasper up and out. I turned to follow them, but a sharp pain in my leg stopped me short. Looking down, I saw one of the creature's hands wrapped around my calf, its claws digging into my flesh. I cried out in pain and fear, desperately kicking at the monster's face. "Help!" I screamed, feeling myself being dragged towards the edge of the loft. Dominic reappeared at the hole in the roof, his eyes wide with horror. Without hesitation, he swung the axe down, aiming for the creature's arm. There was a sickening thud, followed by an otherworldly howl of pain. The grip on my leg loosened, and I scrambled away. Dominic hauled me up onto the roof, where Jasper was waiting, pale and shaking. Below us, we could hear the creature thrashing about, its shrieks of rage echoing through the night. "We need to get down and run," I panted, trying to ignore the burning pain in my leg. "It'll find a way up here soon." We made our way carefully across the slanted roof, the old shingles creaking ominously beneath our weight. At the edge, we found a stack of old crates that offered a precarious but manageable way down. As we descended, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods around the barn seemed alive with shadows, each one potentially hiding another monster waiting to pounce. We had just reached the ground when a thunderous crash came from inside the barn. The creature had found its way onto the roof. "Run!" I yelled, pushing my friends ahead of me. We plunged into the forest, branches whipping at our faces as we ran blindly through the undergrowth. Behind us, I could hear the sound of pursuit. The snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, and worst of all, the rhythmic pounding of inhuman feet. As we ran, a new sound reached my ears, the distant rumble of traffic. The highway, if we could reach it, we might have a chance. "This way!" I gasped, angling our course towards the noise. We burst out of the tree line onto the shoulder of the road, just as a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. I stepped out onto the asphalt, waving my arms frantically. The truck's horn blared as it approached, but it began to slow. For a moment, hope surged through me. We were going to make it. Then Jasper screamed. I turned to see the creature emerging from the woods, its eyeless face fixed on us with terrifying purpose. It began to lope towards us with impossible speed. The truck was almost upon us now. In a split second, I had to make a decision that would determine whether we lived or died. I stepped directly into the path of the oncoming vehicle. The screech of tires filled the air as the truck driver slammed on his brakes. I stood my ground, heart pounding, praying that the vehicle would stop in time. Behind me I could hear the rapid approach of the creature, its inhuman growls growing louder with each passing second. At the last possible moment, I dove to the side. The truck roared past, missing me by inches. There was a sickening thud, followed by an unearthly shriek of pain and rage. I rolled onto my back, gasping for air, to see the creature sprawled across the asphalt. The truck had struck it dead on, but incredibly, it was still moving. Its limbs twisted at unnatural angles as it struggled to right itself, dark ichor oozing from countless wounds. The truck skidded to a halt about 50 yards down the road. Its driver, a middle-aged man with a look of utter shock on his face, stumbled out of the cab. "What the hell was that?" he yelled, his voice shaking. "Are you kids all right?" Before I could answer, the creature let out another bone-chilling cry. It had managed to pull itself upright, its broken body swaying grotesquely. Its eyeless face turned towards us, mouth opening to reveal rows of jagged teeth. "Get back in your truck!" I shouted to the driver. "We need to go now!" The man didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled back into his vehicle as Jasper, Dominic, and I raced towards the passenger side. We piled into the cab just as the creature began to lurch in our direction. "Drive!" Dominic yelled. The truck's engine roared to life, tires spinning on the asphalt as we accelerated away. In the side mirror, I could see the creature giving chase, moving with surprising speed despite its injuries. "What is that thing?" the driver asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "We don't know," I replied, my voice hoarse. "But it's been chasing us all night." "Jesus Christ," the man muttered, pressing harder on the accelerator. For several tense minutes, we sped down the highway, the creature gradually falling behind. Eventually, it disappeared from view entirely. Only then did I allow myself to relax slightly, the adrenaline that had been keeping me going starting to ebb away. "We need to get to the police," Jasper said, wincing as he shifted his broken arm. The driver nodded. "There's a state trooper station about 10 miles up the road. We'll go there." As we drove, I filled the man in on the night's events, leaving out the part about the gummies. He listened in stunned silence, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. "I've been driving these roads for 20 years, he said when I finished. "Never seen anything like that before. You kids are lucky to be alive." I nodded grimly, knowing just how close we had come to death. The image of the creature's eyeless face and gaping maw was seared into my memory, a nightmare that I knew would haunt me for years to come. We reached the state trooper station without further incident. The fluorescent-lit interior felt surreal after the horrors we had faced in the dark woods. The troopers on duty listened to our story with a mix of skepticism and concern, particularly when they saw Jasper's broken arm and the claw marks on my leg. They dispatched units to search the area where we had encountered the creature, but I knew in my heart they wouldn't find anything. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't something that would allow itself to be captured or killed so easily. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the world, our parents arrived at the station. There were tears, hugs, and a barrage of questions that we were too exhausted to fully answer. In the days and weeks that followed, we were interviewed by various authorities, local police, state troopers, even a pair of FBI agents who seemed particularly interested in our description of the creature. But no trace of it was ever found, save for some strange tracks and claw marks on the old barn. Jasper, Dominic, and I made a pact to never speak of that night to anyone else. Who would believe us anyway? But in quiet moments, when the memory of that eyeless face and reaching claws becomes too much to bear, we find comfort in each other's company, in the shared knowledge of what we faced and survived. As for me, I've never returned to that cabin in the woods. Some nights I wake in a cold sweat, certain that I can hear the tap-tap-tap of bony fingers on my window. And always, always, I wonder, what if it's still out there, waiting in the darkness for its next victims? The brisk winter air nipped at my nose as I stepped off the old school bus and into the snow-covered camping grounds of Bass River State Forest. At 10 years old, I was filled with a sense of adventure at the prospect of spending 3 days in the wilderness with my classmates. Little did I know This trip would forever change my life and how I saw the world. Our teachers quickly divided us up into groups and set us to work, pitching tents and gathering firewood. As I hammered tent pegs into the frozen earth alongside my best friend Alison, an eerie sensation washed over me, as if unseen eyes were boring into the back of my skull from the shadowy tree line. I tried to shake it off, reasoning that there were bound to be plenty of animals watching us from the woods. Just then, a bone-chilling howl echoed through the forest, unlike anything I had ever heard before. It sounded almost human, but with an unmistakably lupine timbre that made the hairs on my arms stand on end beneath my thick coat sleeves. Startled, I dropped my hammer into the snow. "Did you hear that?" I asked Alison, my voice quavering. She shrugged. "Probably just a wolf or coyote. Nothing to worry about out here." But I wasn't so sure. There was something profoundly unnatural about the sound that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Still, not wanting to seem like a scaredy cat in front of my peers, I tried to put the disturbing occurrence out of my mind and focus on enjoying the trip. The rest of the day passed uneventfully as we finished setting up camp, cooked dinner over the campfire, and engaged in typical childhood camping activities. But as hard as I tried, I couldn't fully ignore the lingering sense of unease that had taken root in the pit of my stomach. It was as if some primordial intuition was warning me of an unseen danger lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. As the sun dipped below the tree line and the temperatures plummeted, we all gathered close around the warmth of the roaring campfire to roast marshmallows and tell spooky stories. For a time, I was able to lose myself in the camaraderie and forget my earlier trepidation. But as the hours ticked by and the flames began to dwindle, it became clear that we would need to venture back into the woods to restock our supply of firewood. Not wanting to show fear in front of my classmates, I volunteered to search the most foreboding section of forest, figuring my boldness would impress them. Alison shot me a concerned look. "Are you sure, Jess? Maybe we should stick together." I waved off her worry with a devil-may-care grin that belied the hammering of my heart. "I'll be fine." Back before you know it, tramping into the woods alone, I began picking up branches and twigs, the icy air burning my lungs with each breath. But after about 10 minutes, an eerie realization dawned on me. The forest was completely silent. No hooting owls, no skittering night creatures. Not even the sighing of wind through bare branches. A deafening, all-consuming silence pressed in around me. Just as I registered this unnerving absence of sound, a twig snapped like a gunshot somewhere back in the tree line, shattering the oppressive quiet. I leapt nearly a foot in the air, my heart ricocheting against my ribcage. "Hello?" I called out, my voice faltering. "Anybody there?" To my horror, rather than an answering shout from a classmate, my own words echoed back to me from the darkness, but warped and sharpened into something utterly inhuman. It was as if some unseen creature was mockingly parroting me in a grotesque imitation of human speech. Blind panic seized me. Dropping my armload of sticks, I whirled around and sprinted back toward the direction of camp, heedless of the branches that whipped across my face. But with each stretch of distance I covered, I could hear the distinct sound of footsteps crashing through the underbrush behind me, rapidly gaining ground. After a few endless minutes, I risked a glance over my shoulder, hoping to see nothing more than a classmate playing a prank. Instead, my blood turned to ice in my veins. There, shuffling between the trees on legs like a man's but covered in shaggy fur, was a hulking creature. A nightmarish hybrid of beast and human. Its huge lupine head was crowned with a twisting rack of antlers, and its yawning jaws were lined with dagger-like teeth that glinted in the moonlight. But what truly froze me to my core was the expression on its grotesque face, a perverse grin of cruel amusement and malevolent hunger. It was toying with me. Adrenaline surged through my system, and I ran as I had never run before, vaulting over fallen logs and crashing through walls of thorny underbrush, heedless of the bloody scratches that crisscrossed my skin. Rasping breaths tore from my throat, and my pulse thundered in my ears. But still, I pushed myself faster, spurred on by the primal certainty that if the creature caught me, a far worse fate than mere death awaited. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted the welcome glow of the campfire through a gap in the trees. Putting on a final burst of speed, I crashed back into the circle of firelight, collapsing at Allison's feet as exhausted sobs racked my numb body. "Jess, what happened?" she cried, kneeling down and gripping my shoulders. "What's wrong?" Through my tears, I tried to choke out a description of the abomination I had seen. But as I met the circle of confused and concerned faces surrounding me, I knew there was no way they would believe such an outlandish tale. They would think I was crazy or lying for attention. As a wolf, I finally managed. I saw a huge wolf, and then the abyss of unconsciousness rose up and dragged me down into blessed oblivion. I woke late the next morning, safe in my tent, but with a throbbing headache and a heart still gripped by dread. The primal terror of the previous night still seared through my mind, eclipsing any notion that it could have simply been a bad dream or my imagination running away with me. I knew to the marrow of my bones that the antlered abomination had been real and was still out there. I tried to rejoin my classmates as they cooked breakfast and chatted about the day's planned activities. But my participation felt hollow and forced. All I could focus on was the suffocating knowledge that something unutterably evil lurked in those woods, and the all-consuming fear that I would encounter it again. Unable to drum up any sincere interest in hiking or crafts, I mumbled an excuse about not feeling well and retreated to my tent, where I spent the day huddled in my sleeping bag, jumping at every distant sound that filtered through the nylon walls. Allison tried several times to coax me out, but I stubbornly refused, mentally counting down the hours until we would leave this place, and I could try to convince myself it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. The bus ride home passed in a dissociative fog, with the excited voices of my classmates fading to a muffled buzz in my ears. It wasn't until I stumbled through my front door and collapsed into my mother's startled arms that I finally let myself break down, sobbing out an incoherent account of what I had experienced between hiccuping breaths. But seeing the distressed confusion in her eyes, I realized that even my own mother couldn't bring herself to believe my claims about the twisted man-beast in the woods. So I did the only thing I could do. I clammed up, pretending that I had simply gotten worked up over a regular wolf. Everyone knew wolves hadn't been seen in New Jersey in close to a century, but it was still a far more plausible story than the truth. And so that became the official narrative, shared with teachers and classmates and parents, that frightful Jessie had merely been spooked by a wayward wolf or overactive imagination. But deep down, that little girl knew the truth. And as I grew older, I never forgot. 15 years have passed since that terrible night in Bass River State Forest. On the surface, I've moved on with my life, graduated high school, earned a biology degree, started a promising career in wildlife conservation. But even as I grew into a successful, well-adjusted adult, that primordial terror lingered deep within my psyche, forever tainting my relationship with the natural world I had once loved so fiercely. I still venture out into the wilderness as part of my job, but never alone, and never at night. A once bold child has been replaced by a wary, hypervigilant woman who can never fully shake the feeling of being watched from the shadows. Childhood camping trips are a thing of the distant past, and even casual hikes are undertaken with a grim sense of necessity rather than joyful exploration. But despite my unshakable paranoia, I've never encountered another hint of that nightmarish creature. Not even a prickling of déjà vu or a far-off howl that burrows into my shaken bones. As the years ticked by without incident, I started to desperately hope that maybe, just maybe, it had all been the invention of a frightened little girl's mind after all. A mental trick of the light combined with winter boredom and too many ghost stories. But deep down, beneath the comforting lies I tell myself, I know the truth. It's still out there, the faint hope that maybe I truly had imagined the whole terrifying ordeal was forever shattered during a weekend research trip to northern Maine. I was assisting with a study on the ecological impacts of the state's burgeoning black bear population, which meant long days trekking through remote stretches of forest looking for signs of their presence. On the third day, as dusk bled from the sky and I hurried to wrap up my final transect before nightfall, a shiver abruptly ran up my spine and I froze mid-step. The woods around me had gone deathly silent, just as they had that night 15 years before. And in that oppressive hush, broken only by my ragged breathing, I heard it, a long, low howl, undulating through the trees like a death knell, with cadences of agonized human screaming woven through its lupine sonority. And I knew that howl, even after all this time, even with hundreds of miles between me and my childhood trauma. I would never forget that sound for as long as I lived. Abandoning my equipment without a second thought, I turned and bolted back toward the distant field station, not caring about the branches that tore at my face or the burning of my lungs as I gasped for air. Behind me, rapidly gaining, came the familiar snap of twigs and crunch of heavy footfalls. What happened next is a blur of pure, visceral terror. Time fragmented and dilated, seconds stretched into lifetimes. The trees flashed by in a shadowed fever dream as I pushed my body to the brink of collapse. I have brief flashes of bursting from the tree line into the grassy clearing of the station, of collapsing against the door as I frantically typed in the entry code with numb, fumbling fingers, of slamming the reinforced door behind me just as a dark shape lunged from the woods in my peripheral vision. My team found me hours later, still pressed against the door in a near catatonic state. I had no idea how to even begin explaining my actions or the reason for my obvious terror. Luckily, in my panicked flight, I appeared to have severely twisted my ankle. In my distressed state, I let them believe my fear stemmed from the pain and the encroaching night, and once again kept the true horror to myself. That was nearly 5 years ago. Since then, the twisted creature that first shattered my innocence seems to be actively stalking me through my life, a malevolent shadow permanently seared into my psyche. I've heard its telltale howl on a trail in Washington's Hoh rainforest, felt its hungry presence watching me from a copse of trees at the edge of Shenandoah National Park. It never reveals itself fully, but I know it's there, waiting, haunting. The unrelenting paranoia has taken a steep toll. Formerly close friendships have withered under the strain of my mercurial moods and constant guardedness. A promising romance with a fellow conservationist fell apart in the face of my emotional distance and the unpredictable intensity of my reactions to seemingly benign situations. Even my parents have expressed concern over my mental state, though I still haven't been able to bring myself to tell them the full truth. I've thought about checking myself into psychiatric treatment, but I know a shrink would never believe my claims about the creature. They diagnose me with PTSD or schizophrenia, put me on a drug regimen, and send me to counseling. But that wouldn't stop the thing in the woods. So I've learned to cope on my own, though coping may be too generous a word. Surviving is perhaps more apt. I've quit my job to pursue freelance biology work that I can do remotely, minimizing my time spent in forests and rural areas. I never go out after dark if I can help it, and I've moved to a bustling city where I can lose myself in a never-sleeping world of concrete and 24-hour lights. I've become a ghost, drifting through my own life, numb and detached. Anything to avoid the primal terror of the wild. But a new fear has started to consume me of late. Always before, the antlered abomination seemed content to toy with me, to stalk and terrify, but never attack outright. But lately, I can't shake the feeling that its cruel amusement may finally be giving way to darker appetites. That one day, very soon, it will tire of this long game of cat and mouse and come for me at last, no matter where I try to hide. And when it does, I know that no therapy or holy water or electrified walls will save me. Because the most horrifying truth, the one I can barely admit even to myself, is this. In some deep, primal part of my soul, I don't want to be saved. I want to be caught. I want to be consumed by the very horror I've spent half my life fleeing. Because even that unspeakable fate would be a perverse relief compared to the endless torture of this waking nightmare that is my life. I know it's out there still, in the woods and in the marrow of my bones, and it's only a matter of time before this story comes to its inescapable end. If you're reading this, it means my worst fears have finally come to pass. I'm penning this final chapter now, even before the end has come, because I know that when it happens, it will be sudden and total, with no time for final contemplations or parting words. So let this stand as my final testament, my desperate attempt to make sense of the unfathomable horror that has defined my existence for the past 20 years. I don't know what the creature is, whether it's a demon, a fey monster, or some evolutionary nightmare sprung from nature's cruelest shadows. What I do know is that it's implacably evil, a predator that seems to feed as much on terror as on flesh. It corrupts the very fabric of the wild, turning forests that should be cathedrals of natural splendor into blasphemous lairs seething with insidious wrongness. And I know that it has utterly destroyed me, not quickly, in a single slashing of fangs and claws, but slowly, insidiously over a lifetime of never allowing me to feel safe even for a moment. Every second of my adulthood, every breath, every heartbeat, has been tainted by its malign presence. It has devoured my potential for happiness or normality as surely as if it had physically ripped the heart from my chest. I never stood a chance. An innocent child's psyche is fertile ground for such a potent seed of trauma to take root and blossom into a poisoned tree that strangles everything else. I was doomed from the moment I set foot in those woods and locked eyes with that twisted hybrid of beast and man. So this is my warning to anyone who ventures into the forests that humans once knew to fear down in their primal marrow. Be wary. The old gods and monsters of myth still lurk in the shadows beyond our orderly modern lives. And they're always ravenous. But even more so, this is my bitter elegy to a life half-lived, to the carefree young girl I can barely remember being. To all the joy and love and light I might have known, had I not looked into the abyss at far too tender an age. And to the numb shell of a woman that abyss has finally, inexorably reclaimed. I hear it now, out in the night. That long, low howl that heralds my doom. The death knell for any illusion that I might have ever truly escaped. It has come for me at last. The autumn chill seeped through my jacket as I drove along the winding road into the forests of northern Alberta. The towering pines closed in around me, their branches swaying in the evening breeze. I glanced at the dashboard clock. 6:34 p.m., September 12, 1998. My name is Michael Benson, and at 32 years old, I thought I'd seen everything these woods had to offer. I'd been coming out here for solo camping and hunting trips for over a decade now, relishing the solitude and escape from city life back in Edmonton. But this trip would be different. As I navigated the pothole-strewn dirt road leading to the trailhead, I couldn't shake an unsettling feeling deep in my gut. Something about the way the shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally in the fading light, the eerie stillness that had fallen over the forest. The usual sounds of birdsong and chittering squirrels were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of my tires on the gravel. I tried to brush aside the unease as I parked the truck and hoisted my camping pack from the back. Just nerves, I told myself. Too many late nights watching horror flicks. But as I set out along the trail, my boots thudding softly on the carpet of fallen leaves, the feeling only intensified. The forest felt different somehow, unwelcoming. The trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the old cabin where I'd be spending the next 2 nights. Inhaling deeply, I savored the sharp, earthy scent of pines and damp soil, trying to ground myself in the familiar. As I hiked, my mind wandered to the strange stories I'd heard whispered around town in the days leading up to my trip. Tales of unnatural creatures stalking these woods, spoken in hushed tones over beers at the local dive bar. The old-timers swore up and down that they were more than just legends, that there was something out there, something ancient and malevolent. They had a name for it: Skinwalker, a shapeshifter, born from the darkest witchcraft, able to take on the form of any animal or even mimic human voices to lure in its prey. I'd laughed it off at the time, dismissing the stories as drunken nonsense and superstition, fairy tales to scare kids around the campfire. But out here, miles from civilization, with only the trees and lengthening shadows for company, those tales didn't seem quite so far-fetched anymore. A twig snapped behind me and I spun around, my heart pounding. But there was nothing there, just the silent woods stretching out in every direction. "Get a grip," I chided myself, forcing my feet to keep moving. "You've been out here 100 times. Nothing to be scared of." Night had fallen by the time I reached the cabin. The small, weathered structure huddled in a clearing, its wooden slats silvered with age. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate the sagging porch and single-shuttered window. Something about the cabin felt off, even more so than the rest of the forest. A heaviness hung in the air, a sense of foreboding that prickled the hairs on the back of my neck. For a moment I hesitated, considering turning back, hiking the 4 miles back to my truck and getting the hell out of there. But exhaustion won out over unease. I'd been walking for hours with a heavy pack, and my legs felt like rubber. The next town was nearly 50 miles away. Resigned, I climbed the creaking steps and shouldered open the door, wincing as it groaned on rusted hinges. Inside, the cabin was musty and thick with cobwebs. I swept my flashlight beam around the single room. A moth-eaten cot in one corner, a cracked wood stove, a table and chairs coated in a thick layer of dust. As I stepped inside, the floorboards protested loudly underfoot. Setting my pack down, I focused on the familiar routine of making camp, laying out my sleeping bag, building a small fire in the stove to chase away the chill. But even as I went through the motions, that sense of being watched never left me. It felt as if the very walls were pressing in, as if something in the darkness beyond the tree line had its eyes fixed on me. Shaking off the unease, I forced myself to eat a meager dinner of trail mix and jerky. But the food sat heavy in my stomach, my appetite gone. All I could think about was crawling into my sleeping bag and praying for a dreamless sleep. As I banked the fire and readied for bed, I retrieved the old hunting rifle from my pack, checking that it was loaded before propping it within easy reach of the cot. Just a precaution, I told myself, against bears or whatever might be out there. But as I laid down and closed my eyes, I couldn't quite convince myself. Sleep eluded me that night. I laid on the narrow cot, staring up at the shadowy rafters, every creak of the old cabin, setting my nerves on edge. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the chinks in the walls and rattling the shutters. But underneath it, I swore I could hear something else, the soft tread of footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. My rational mind dismissed it as a deer, or maybe a raccoon, foraging in the underbrush. But another part of me, the primal part that recognized the sound of a predator, knew better. The footsteps drew closer until they sounded just outside the walls. I strained my ears, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. Then came the breathing, low and guttural, a rasping sound that sent chills skittering down my spine. It was coming from just beyond the door, as if someone or something was standing there listening. I held my own breath, not daring to move. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. I didn't know how long I laid there, frozen, before the sound moved on, footsteps fading around the side of the cabin. But even as they receded, I couldn't relax. Every instinct screamed danger. A sudden bang on the roof had me jolting upright, a strangled cry escaping my throat. Something heavy was moving overhead now, thudding from one end of the cabin to the other. It sounded huge, far too large to be any animal I'd encountered in these woods before. Adrenaline surging, I groped for my rifle in the dark, clutching it to my chest like a talisman. The thudding continued, moving in a deliberate pattern, as if searching for a way in. A loose shutter, an open window. I briefly considered making a run for it, but quickly dismissed the idea. Out there in the darkened woods, I'd be utterly at its mercy. I strained my ears, trying to track the sounds over the hammering of my heart. Suddenly they stopped. For a few tense seconds there was silence. Then a low keening began, an agonized rumbling that seemed to come from deep in the creature's throat. The keening rose in volume until it was nearly deafening, a howl of hunger and malice that reverberated through the cabin. The hellish wailing lasted what felt like ages, filling my head until I thought my skull might split open. I clamped my hands over my ears, eyes squeezed tightly shut, and prayed to a God I wasn't even sure I believed in. If it gets in, I promised myself, I'd put a bullet in my own head before I let it take me. Then, abruptly, the howling ceased. The night lurched back into eerie silence, broken only by the frenzied drumming of my heart. Minutes sketched by torturously, with no sound but the rasp of my own panicked breathing. Eventually, I must have drifted into an exhausted, fitful sleep, because the next thing I knew, pale fingers of sunlight were filtering through the cracks in the shutters. I sat up groggily, entire body aching, momentarily confused about where I was. Then the memories of the night before came rushing back, and I leapt to my feet, rifle at the ready. On shaky legs, I made my way to the door and eased it open, dreading what I might find. Early morning mist clung to the ground, the air heavy with damp and an earthy petrichor scent. Everything looked reassuringly normal. The same gnarled trees, the same carpet of russet leaves. No hulking beasts crouched in the underbrush ready to pounce. But as I stepped off the porch, I froze. There in the soft dirt around the cabin were footprints, dozens of them, far too large to belong to any normal forest creature. And beside them, as if in macabre contrast, was a second set, the unmistakable tread of hiking boots. Human footprints, my own footprints, walking around the cabin. But that was impossible. I knew I'd never left the cabin in the night, not even to relieve myself. I'd been far too terrified to even approach the door. So how? As I knelt to examine the prints more closely, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Because there, pressed deep into one of the larger tracks, was the clear impression of a human handprint, as if the creature, whatever it was, had planted its hand on the ground to push itself up. And the print was a mirror image to my own. I don't remember packing up camp. The next clear memory I have is of crashing through the woods at a dead run, my pack abandoned, clutching my rifle like it was the only real thing in a world that had suddenly tilted into madness. Branches tore at my face and clothes as I ran, but I barely felt them. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between myself and that accursed cabin. By the time I reached my truck, my lungs were bursting and a stitch stabbed like a knife in my side. I practically flung myself into the cab, slamming the door and locking it, as if that flimsy barrier could actually keep the horrors at bay. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The truck roared to life, and I gunned the accelerator, spraying a hail of gravel as I fishtailed back onto the dirt road. I didn't let up on the gas until the turn-off for the trailhead had receded in my rearview mirror, the dark tree line swallowing it from view. Even then, I kept glancing in the mirror, unreasonably terrified that I might see a twisted figure in the road behind me. Loping along on misshapen limbs, its features a monstrous echo of my own. It was only when I reached the main highway, the familiar asphalt unfurling like a promise of sanity, that I began to breathe normally again. I drove straight through to Edmonton without stopping, not wanting to be alone with my thoughts. Every time I blinked, I saw those footprints burned on the insides of my eyelids. The implications of it wormed insidiously through my brain, sickening me. It wasn't until I stumbled through the door of my apartment, exhausted and strung out, that the enormity of what I'd experienced hit me. I stripped off my filthy clothes with shaking hands and stepped into the shower, cranking the water as hot as I could stand it, as if I could somehow sear away the memories, the primal terror that still had me in its grip. I stayed in there until the water ran cold and my skin was reddened and raw. Then I collapsed into bed, burrowing under the covers like a child afraid of the dark. When sleep finally came, it was thin and restless, plagued by dreams of grasping shadows and the guttural howl of something wearing my own face. In the days that followed, I threw myself back into my work at the accounting firm, desperate for any distraction from the incessant replay of that night in the woods. My co-workers commented on my haggard appearance, the dark circles carved under my eyes, but I shrugged off their concern. How could I even begin to explain? It hardly made sense in my own mind. I found myself jumping at shadows, whirling around at the slightest sound, convinced that the skinwalker had somehow followed me back to the city. Mirrors became an intolerable dread. I couldn't look at my own reflection without picturing that handprint in the mud, and wondering what kind of twisted imitation might be staring back at me. Weeks dragged by in that state of twitchy hypervigilance. I knew I was unraveling, could feel my grip on reality becoming more and more tenuous. I began thinking about trying to track down some of the natives who had been hinting at the dark history of those woods. Maybe someone would understand, would have some answers. But the idea of even speaking about what had happened filled me with a superstitious dread, as if voicing it aloud might somehow summon the creature back into my life, give it power. So I stayed silent, the secrets festering like poison inside of me, until one night, almost 2 months after my trip to the cabin, I was jolted out of a restless doze by a sound that turned my blood to slushy ice, a low scratching at my window like nails dragging across glass. For a panicked moment, I was back in that clearing, huddled in the darkness with a nameless horror clawing at the walls. Then my eyes flew open, and I saw it. Just beyond the window pane, silhouetted against the orange glare of the streetlights, was a shadowy figure. At first glance it looked human, but there was something horribly wrong with its proportions, its angles, like a reanimated corpse, putrid and misshapen. As I watched in mute, paralytic terror, it raised one twisted hand and rapped on the glass. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if pulled by invisible marionette strings. The hand was bloated and mottled grey, the fingers ending in jagged black claws. Bile burned the back of my throat as I realized they were the exact size and shape of those impossible footprints. "Let me in," it rasped, and the voice was a guttural parody of my own. "Let me in, let me in, let me wear your skin." A scream clawed its way up my throat, but it emerged only as a whimper. I lunged for the gun I now kept on my nightstand, but my fear-clumsy fingers fumbled uselessly at the drawer handle. By the time I yanked it open and grabbed the pistol, the figure had vanished, melted back into the shadows as if it had never been. That was the final straw. The next morning, I was in my manager's office, stammering through a half-coherent request for an extended leave of absence. I'm not sure what he saw in my haggard, haunted face, but he didn't press for details. Just quietly approved my request and told me to take all the time I needed. I went home and booked the first flight out to Vancouver. From there, I rented a car and began driving east with no clear destination in mind. All I knew was that I needed to get as far away from Edmonton, from those damned woods, as possible. I barely slept, surviving on a steady diet of black coffee and gas station snacks. Every time I closed my eyes, that grotesque face swam up from the depths of my nightmares. The road became my only constant, an endless ribbon of asphalt unspooling before me. I lost track of the days, the miles bleeding together. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the growing certainty that it was only a matter of time before the skinwalker found me again. That twisted imitation of myself, driven by some malevolent hunger I couldn't begin to comprehend. It wasn't until I found myself on the outskirts of a small town in Ontario, exhausted and nearly out of gas, that I finally stopped running. In a dingy motel room that smelled of mildew and stale cigarette smoke, I faced the grim truth. There was nowhere left to run. Whatever this thing was, it wouldn't stop until it had me in its grasp. In that moment, I nearly put my pistol to my own temple and pulled the trigger. At least that way I'd cheat the creature of its twisted prize. But some stubborn flicker of self-preservation stayed my hand. If I was going to go down, it wouldn't be like a dog in some seedy motel. I owed myself that much. So I began to research, trawling through internet forums and obscure occult texts, looking for anything that might give me an edge. I learned the skinwalkers were dark shamans, practitioners of a twisted magic fueled by the consumption of human flesh. That once they'd caught your scent, they'd never stop hunting you. But I also learned there might be ways to fight back. Old rituals and protective charms handed down through generations of native lore. I began amassing a collection, bundles of sage and cedar, fetishes of bone and animal hide. I learned the proper rituals, the prayers and invocations meant to ward off evil. And all the while I felt the skinwalker's presence, hovering just at the edges of my awareness, waiting for me to let my guard down. Armed with my newfound knowledge and talismans, I set out for one final confrontation. I wouldn't let this creature dictate my life any longer. I returned to those cursed woods, to the very cabin where my nightmare had begun. As I stepped into the clearing, the night seemed to hold its breath. The moon cast an eerie silver glow over the derelict cabin, shadows lurching across its sagging walls. With shaking hands, I laid out my fetishes, murmuring the protective incantations under my breath. No sooner had I finished the last charm than a bone-chilling howl rent the air. It was close, so much closer than I'd anticipated. Heart hammering, I whirled to face the tree line, my rifle at the ready. The creature emerged from the shadows, a grotesque mockery of human form. Its misshapen limbs twitched and jerked as if pulled by unseen strings, its flesh pitted and oozing. But worst of all were its eyes, pitch black and utterly soulless, burning with a feral, insatiable hunger. It lunged at me with startling speed, a blur of mottled flesh and cruel claws. I fired on instinct, the shot going wide in my panic. We collided in a tangle of thrashing limbs, the stench of decay overwhelming. Claws raked my arms, my face, as I grappled with the monster. I could feel my strength flagging, my vision blurring at the edges. In desperation, I grabbed for one of the fetishes, thrusting it at the creature's distorted face. To my shock, it recoiled with an unearthly shriek, flesh sizzling where the charm touched it. Emboldened, I pushed myself to my feet, brandishing the fetish like a holy relic. I began to chant, the ancient words pouring from my bloodied lips like a battle cry. The skinwalker writhed and howled as if in agony, its form seeming to waver and distort. With each word it diminished, folding in on itself like a nightmarish origami. And then, between one blink and the next, it was simply gone, leaving only a patch of scorched earth and the echo of its screams. Exhausted and bloodied, I nearly collapsed where I stood. It was over. After months of terror, of running and hiding, I was free. The skinwalker's curse had been broken. I staggered back to my car, barely remembering the drive back to town. In the following days, as my wounds healed and my story spread, I was hailed as a local hero, the man who had faced down a monster and lived. But I knew the truth. I was no hero, just a man who had been lucky enough, or perhaps crazy enough, to survive. Years have passed since that fateful night, but the memories remain vivid, seared into my mind like a brand. I left Edmonton, left the life I had known in search of some semblance of peace. But deep down, I know the skinwalker is still out there, waiting in the shadows of forgotten places, hungering for new prey. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I swear I can hear its howls on the wind, a chilling reminder that evil never truly dies. It simply waits, patient and eternal, for the unwary to stumble into its embrace once more. I never expected to find myself the owner of my father's farm. After his sudden death from a stroke last August, I discovered he'd left it to me in his will. My older brother Michael had no interest in rural living, preferring his corporate life in Boston, and our youngest sibling Hannah was finishing her master's degree in California. That left me, Thomas Bennett, 34 and recently divorced, to decide what to do with a property I'd only visited a handful of times. The farmhouse sat isolated at the end of a long, dusty road in western Pennsylvania, bordered on two sides by dense woodland that stretched for miles. A dried-up creek bed cut through the property, once a pleasant feature that had completely vanished during the severe drought of 2022, the year before Dad died. When I arrived that September evening, the setting sun cast long shadows across the overgrown fields. The two-story farmhouse looked smaller than I remembered, its white paint peeling and grey shutters hanging askew. Dad had purchased it 8 years ago after retiring, drawn to its seclusion and the opportunity to grow his own food. My mother had refused to leave their comfortable suburban home, creating a strange arrangement where they'd visit each other monthly. I pulled my Toyota to a stop beside Dad's old pickup truck, which I couldn't bring myself to sell. Dust swirled around my feet as I stepped out, the air still and uncomfortably warm despite autumn's approach. The house had been vacant for nearly a month since Dad's death, and it showed. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of dust and abandonment. I flipped on lights as I moved through the small living room with its outdated floral sofa and Dad's worn leather recliner positioned perfectly in front of an ancient television. The kitchen was clean but sparse. Dad had never been much of a cook. Upstairs, 3 small bedrooms and a single bathroom completed the modest home. After bringing in my suitcases, I opened windows to air out the musty rooms. As twilight deepened into darkness, I heated a can of soup on the stove and settled into Dad's recliner, flipping through channels until I found the weather forecast. More drought was predicted. Bad news for the small vegetable garden Dad had maintained, now withering from neglect. A strong gust of wind suddenly rattled the windows, making me jump. The weather report hadn't mentioned storms. I got up to check outside, but the sky remained clear, stars visible in the moonless night. As I turned to go back inside, I noticed something odd. The soil around the foundation had deep cracks running through it, some so wide I could have fit my fingers inside. That night, I slept in the master bedroom surrounded by Dad's things. His reading glasses still sat on the nightstand next to a dog-eared Louis L'Amour Western. I fell into a troubled sleep, dreaming of running through endless cornfields while something tall and dark pursued me. I awoke to silence. The digital clock reading 3:27 a.m. The farmhouse creaked and settled around me in the darkness. Then I heard it, footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Slow, deliberate, and oddly wet, like someone walking in soaked shoe. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly small in the darkness. The footsteps stopped immediately. I told myself it was just the house settling or my imagination working overtime in an unfamiliar place. But as I lay there, heart pounding, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was standing just outside my door, listening. By morning, I'd convinced myself the footsteps were just a product of stress and exhaustion. I spent the day exploring the property, assessing what needed repair, and going through Dad's paperwork. The drought had taken a visible toll. The fields were barren, the soil cracked and hard as concrete. The creek bed that gave the property its name, Creek Farm, was nothing but a dry, dusty channel cutting through the eastern edge of the land. I found Dad's journal in his desk drawer. He documented everything meticulously: rainfall amounts, crop yields, wildlife sightings. What struck me was his repeated mention of how peaceful he found the place, how well he slept here compared to the suburbs. "Never felt more at home," he'd written just weeks before his death. That evening, I called my brother Michael. "How's the haunted farmhouse?" He joked. "It's not haunted," I replied, though the memory of those wet footsteps lingered. "Just quiet. Too quiet sometimes. You're not actually thinking of staying there, are you?" "I thought you'd sell it." I hesitated. "I might stay a while. I can work remotely, and after the divorce I could use some space," Michael sighed. "Just don't turn into Dad. He got weird out there by himself." "Weird how?" "You didn't notice?" "The last couple years he seemed, I don't know, distant, like he was half somewhere else when we visited. Mom noticed it too. I hadn't noticed, but then I'd been dealing with my own collapsing marriage during those visits, too preoccupied to pay close attention to Dad's behavior. After hanging up, I went to bed early, exhausted from the day's work. This time, I left the bedroom door slightly ajar and the hallway light on. If there were any strange noises, I wanted to see their source. I must have fallen asleep quickly, because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake to that same sound, wet, shuffling footsteps in the hallway. The digital clock read 3:16 a.m. The footsteps moved rhythmically back and forth, from one end of the hallway to the other. Through the crack in my door, I could see nothing but the empty hallway, illuminated by the dim light I'd left on. I forced myself to get up, moving slowly to avoid making the floorboards creak. As I approached the door, the footsteps continued, oblivious to my movement. With one quick motion, I yanked the door open wide. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued for a split second before stopping abruptly, now seemingly coming from directly in front of me. I felt a cold spot in the air, as though I'd walked into a pocket of winter in the otherwise warm house. I stood frozen, straining to see something, anything, in the empty space before me. The house went silent except for the hammering of my heart. "Dad?" I whispered, feeling ridiculous even as I said it. No response came, but as I turned to go back to bed, I noticed something on the hardwood floor, a single wet footprint, much larger than my own foot, elongated and narrow. Before I could examine it closer, it evaporated, leaving no trace. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning I called Hannah. Unlike Michael, she'd been close to Dad, visiting the farm more frequently. Did Dad ever mention anything unusual about the house? I asked after our initial greetings. Unusual how? I hesitated. Like noises at night, or, I don't know, weird feelings. Hannah was quiet for a moment. He told me once that he felt like he wasn't alone there, even when he was. But he said it comforted him, especially after the drought started. Why? Are you experiencing something? I couldn't bring myself to describe the footsteps. Just getting used to all the nighttime sounds. It's different from the city. Tom, Hannah's voice grew serious. There's something else. The week before Dad died, he called me, sounding disoriented. He said something about the creek coming back, which made no sense because of the drought. When I pressed him, he got confused and changed the subject. I meant to drive out and check on him, but then, "It's not your fault," I said quickly. No one could have predicted he'd have a stroke. After we hung up, I walked out to the dried creek bed. The drought had only worsened since Dad's death. There wasn't a drop of moisture in sight, just cracked earth and dead vegetation. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the tree line that bordered the property. That night, I decided to stay awake. I stationed myself in Dad's recliner with a book and a pot of coffee, determined to catch whatever was making those footsteps. The hours crept by, and my eyelids grew heavy despite the caffeine. At precisely 3:14 a.m., I heard it, the wet, shuffling sound. But this time, it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was in the kitchen. I rose slowly, grabbing a flashlight from the side table. The shuffling continued, a methodical back-and-forth pattern. I moved toward the kitchen doorway, flashlight gripped tightly in my trembling hand. When I reached the doorway and pointed the beam inside, what I saw made me drop the flashlight, which clattered to the floor and went out. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, was pacing back and forth across the kitchen floor. It was pitch black, not just dark-colored, but seeming to absorb the light around it. Its proportions were wrong, limbs too long, torso too narrow, and its head a featureless void that nearly brushed against the ceiling. Each step it took left a glistening wet footprint that evaporated seconds later. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The entity continued its pacing, showing no awareness of my presence. In the darkness, I could make out what looked like a thin appendage trailing behind it, a tail, or perhaps some kind of tendril. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to back away, fumbling blindly until I reached the front door. I spent the rest of the night in my car, doors locked, too terrified to go back inside. Dawn found me still in my car, stiff and exhausted. In the light of day, my experience seemed absurd, impossible. I briefly considered leaving, packing up and never returning, but something held me back. This was my inheritance, my responsibility now. And if Dad had lived here for years, presumably with this thing, then it couldn't be immediately dangerous, could it? After a cautious return to the house, finding everything normal, I drove into town. Millfield was small, just a few thousand residents, with a single main street of businesses. I found the local library, a brick building from the early 1900s, and approached the elderly librarian. "I'm looking for information about Creek Farm," I explained. "My father, Robert Bennett, owned it. I've inherited it now." The librarian, who introduced herself as Mrs. Wallace, nodded sympathetically. "I remember your father. Quiet man, came in for farming books mostly." She hesitated. "Creek Farm has an interesting history. Are you researching anything specific?" I chose my words carefully. "I'm curious about any stories associated with the property. Local legends, historical events, that sort of thing." Something flickered across her face. Recognition, perhaps even concern. "Let me show you our local history section." Mrs. Wallace led me to a small room in the back, filled with archives, bound newspapers, and local history books. She pulled several volumes from the shelves, along with a folder of newspaper clippings. "Creek Farm gets its name from Blackwater Creek, which used to run much stronger before the recent droughts," she explained. "The property has changed hands many times over the years, which is unusual for this area. Families tend to hold onto farmland for generations." I skimmed through the materials she provided. Creek Farm had been established in the 1870s by the Wilson family, who sold it unexpectedly in 1894 after a series of crop failures. Subsequent owners rarely stayed more than a decade. The property had been abandoned entirely between 1967 and 1978, until a developer purchased it, renovated the farmhouse, and flipped it. "Was there ever any mention of unusual occurrences at the property?" I asked. Mrs. Wallace's expression became guarded. "What kind of occurrences?" "Anything out of the ordinary. Unexplained phenomena." She sighed, then reached for a book on a higher shelf. "This is a collection of local folklore compiled in the 1950s. There's a chapter on Creek Farm." The book, bound in faded green cloth, contained hand-typed accounts of local legends. I found the relevant chapter, "The Drought Walker of Blackwater Creek." According to the account, dating back to settler days, during particularly severe droughts, something would emerge from the deepest part of Blackwater Creek, described as a tall, shadow-like figure. It would appear when the creek dried completely, walking the property at night with the sound of water following its steps. The entity wasn't described as malevolent. Rather, it seemed to be searching for something, pacing endlessly until the rains returned and the creek flowed again. "This is just old superstition," Mrs. Wallace said, though her tone lacked conviction. "Every rural area has these kinds of stories. Has anyone else reported seeing something like this? Recently, I mean." She hesitated. "I shouldn't say, but your father mentioned something to my husband once, at the hardware store, about footsteps at night. Joseph thought he was joking, but your father seemed genuinely puzzled by it. I felt a chill, despite the library's warmth. Did he describe what he heard? Just that they sounded wet, like someone had been swimming. He found it strange because of the drought." She looked at me intently. "Are you hearing things out there, Mr. Bennett?" I nodded slowly. And seeing things too. Mrs. Wallace didn't seem surprised. The old-timers used to say that the drought walker appears when the creek is at its driest, searching for water. They said it's been trapped here since the land was first settled, cut off from wherever it came from when the settlers redirected part of the creek for irrigation. Is it dangerous? Not according to the stories. It's described more as a lost soul than a malevolent entity. But it's just folklore, Mr. Bennet. She didn't sound convinced of her own words. I checked out several books, including the folklore collection, and thanked Mrs. Wallace for her help. As I was leaving, she called after me, "Mr. Bennet?" The stories also say that the drought walker is most active just before the drought breaks. Like it can sense the coming rain. I drove back to the farm with my mind racing. The forecast showed no rain for at least another week, and meteorologists were calling this the worst drought in 50 years. If the folklore was to be believed, the entity, the drought walker, would be particularly active. That night, I set up a makeshift monitoring system. I positioned my laptop to record the kitchen, turned on all the lights, and settled into the living room with a clear view of the kitchen doorway. I decided that if I saw the entity again, I would try to communicate with it. As 3 a.m. approached, I felt myself growing drowsy despite my determination to stay awake. My eyelids grew heavy, and I caught myself nodding off repeatedly. At 3:12 a.m., the lights in the kitchen flickered once, twice, then stabilized. And then I heard it, the familiar wet footsteps. I forced myself to stand, to move toward the kitchen. The sound grew louder as I approached, shuffle, drip, in a steady rhythm. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the doorway. It was there, just as before, impossibly tall, inhumanly thin. A silhouette of perfect blackness pacing methodically across the kitchen floor. With each step, water seemed to seep from its feet, creating those wet footprints that evaporated moments later. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The entity stopped abruptly. Its featureless head turned toward me, though it had no visible eyes. I felt rather than saw its attention focus on me, a pressure, a weight of observation that made it difficult to breathe. For several seconds we regarded each other in silence. Then slowly it resumed its pacing, as though I were of no consequence. Back and forth, leaving those ephemeral wet footprints. I stood watching it for nearly an hour, until suddenly, at 4:17 a.m., it simply vanished. One moment it was there, the next gone, leaving the kitchen empty and dry. When I checked my laptop, the video showed nothing, just an empty kitchen throughout the night. Whatever this entity was, it didn't register on digital media. As September gave way to October, the drought intensified. News reports called it historic and unprecedented. Water restrictions were implemented throughout the county, and farmers watched helplessly as their livelihood withered. I maintained my small vegetable garden using collected rainwater from the rare, brief showers that passed through. The drought walker, as I'd come to call it, appeared every night like clockwork, always at 3:14 a.m., always pacing for exactly 1 hour and 3 minutes before vanishing. I'd grown accustomed to its presence, even setting my alarm to observe it. Sometimes I spoke to it, though it never responded. I'd grown bold enough to enter the kitchen while it paced, standing still as it moved around me, close enough that I could feel a damp coolness emanating from its form. I tried to document its existence, cameras, audio recorders, even motion sensors, but technology failed to capture any evidence. The entity existed in a blind spot of modern instrumentation, visible and audible only to human senses. One morning, after another night of observing the entity, I decided to explore the dried creek bed more thoroughly. The October sun beat down relentlessly as I followed the cracked earth that had once been Blackwater Creek. The main channel ran along the eastern edge of my property before disappearing into the woods, but smaller tributary channels spread across the land like veins. As I walked the largest channel into the woods, I noticed the trees growing denser, older. These weren't the same species as the rest of the forest. These were cypress and water oaks, trees that belonged in wetlands, not the mixed hardwood forest that dominated the area. About a half-mile in, the creek bed widened into what must have once been a substantial pool, possibly a small pond. Now it was just a depression in the earth, cracked and barren. At its center stood the remains of a stone structure, a small dam or weir partially collapsed. I approached the structure cautiously. It was clearly old, the stonework reminiscent of 19th century construction. Carved into one of the larger stones was a date, 1893. As I examined the structure more closely, I noticed something odd. The ground immediately around it wasn't cracked like the rest of the creek bed. It remained smooth, almost moist-looking, though it was dry to the touch. And there was something else, a symbol carved beside the date, worn by time but still visible, a crude representation of a tall, thin figure. I took photos with my phone, then continued exploring. Beyond the old dam, the creek bed narrowed again and descended into a ravine. The temperature seemed to drop as I made my way down, the air becoming notably cooler. At the bottom of the ravine, I found what appeared to be a natural spring, though now it was just a small depression in the rock, bone dry. Surrounding the spring were more carvings, these much older than the dam. They reminded me of Native American petroglyphs I'd seen in museums, stylized figures and animals. One figure appeared repeatedly, tall, elongated, with what looked like water flowing from its feet. A sound behind me made me turn suddenly, a rustling in the underbrush. I scanned the woods but saw nothing, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the same sensation I'd experienced near the house. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" Only silence answered, but as I made my way back to the farm, I repeatedly glanced over my shoulder, certain that something was following me from a distance. That evening, I drove back into town to search for more information. The local historical society was housed in a Victorian mansion at the edge of Millfield. The curator, a retired history professor named Dr. Harper, greeted me with interest when I mentioned Creek Farm. "The Bennett property," he nodded. "One of our more historically significant farmsteads, though few people realize it." I showed him the photos I'd taken of the stone structure and the carvings. His expression grew serious as he examined them. "This confirms something I've long suspected," he said. "The original Wilson farmstead was built on what was once a sacred site to the indigenous Lenape people. This spring you found was likely considered a spiritual place." "What about the stone structure, the dam?" "That would be the Wilson Dam, would be. Historical records indicate that Thomas Wilson diverted part of Blackwater Creek in 1893 to create a reservoir for irrigation. There was a significant drought that year." Dr. Harper pulled a large map from a drawer. "See here?" He essentially cut off this section of the creek, which used to flow in a different pattern. The map, dated 1890, showed Blackwater Creek following a different course through what was now my property, with the spring serving as one of its primary sources. The following year, 1894, the Wilson family abandoned the property quite suddenly, Dr. So, Harper continued. Local newspapers attributed it to crop failures, but private correspondence I've uncovered suggests another reason. Apparently, the family was experiencing what they described as a haunting after building the dam. What? A kind of haunting? The accounts are vague. Footsteps at night, a sense of being watched, strange noises from the dried portions of the creek bed. Thomas Wilson became convinced that by damming the creek, he had trapped or angered something that lived in the water. His wife described him as becoming increasingly paranoid, insisting that something was pacing outside their bedroom at night. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature, and no other explanation was found. None that satisfied historical scrutiny. The Wilson family fled, selling the property at a significant loss. Subsequent owners reported similar experiences during drought periods when the creek's flow was diminished. Dr. Harper studied me. "Are you experiencing anything unusual, Mr. Bennett?" I considered lying, but decided against it. Footsteps at night, and I've seen something, a figure that doesn't seem quite human. Instead of dismissing me, Dr. Harper nodded thoughtfully. The Lenape had stories of water spirits, Manitou associated with specific bodies of water. When European settlers arrived and began altering the landscape, damming streams and draining wetlands, many of these stories evolved to include elements of entrapment or displacement. You think this, Drought Walker, could be something like that, a water spirit trapped when the creek was dammed? I'm a historian, Mr. Bennett, not a folklorist or paranormal investigator, but I will say this. Across cultures, there are remarkably consistent stories about entities associated with bodies of water, particularly in cases where those water sources have been disrupted by human activity. Before I left, Dr. Harper gave me copies of the Wilson family letters and several academic papers on Lenape water folklore. Whatever you're experiencing, he said, it seems to be connected to both the drought and the historical alteration of Blackwater Creek. Be careful out there. That night, as 3 a.m. approached, I felt a growing sense of dread. For the first time since I'd begun observing it, the entity's appearance frightened me. Was I sharing my home with a displaced spirit, trapped and searching for its lost water source for over a century? At precisely 3:14 a.m., the wet footsteps began, but not in the kitchen. They were outside, moving around the perimeter of the house. I went to the window and in the dim moonlight saw it. The tall black figure walking slowly around the farmhouse, its movements more deliberate than its usual pacing. It paused at each window as though looking inside before moving to the next. When it reached my window, it stopped. Though it had no eyes, I felt it looking directly at me. It raised one impossibly long arm and pressed what might have been a hand against the glass. Water seemed to flow from its touch, running down the window pane like tears. I stumbled backward, heart racing. The entity remained at the window for several minutes before resuming its circuit of the house. By dawn, it had vanished, but the window where it had touched remained fogged, as though viewed through a light rain. I couldn't sleep after the entity's display. As soon as businesses opened, I drove into town, determined to learn more. My first stop was the county records office, where I requested all historical documents related to Creek Farm and Blackwater Creek. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Beverly, raised her eyebrows at my request. That's a lot of material. Some of it's quite old, not even digitized yet. Mind if I ask why you need it? I inherited the property, I explained. I'm trying to understand its water rights history, especially given the current drought. This practical reason seemed to satisfy her. Give me a few hours to pull everything together. In the meantime, you might want to talk to Howard Jennings. His family has been here since before the town was founded. He knows more about local water history than anyone. Beverly directed me to a small coffee shop where Howard, a man in his 80s, could reliably be found each morning. I located him easily, white-haired, weather-beaten, holding court among a group of similarly aged men. When I introduced myself as the new owner of Creek Farm, a hush fell over the table. Bennett's boy, Howard said, sizing me up. Heard you moved in after your daddy passed. Staying through the winter, are you? That's the plan. I'm trying to learn more about the property, especially Blackwater Creek and its history. The old men exchanged glances. Finally, Howard gestured to an empty chair. Sit down, son. There's things about that creek you ought to know. Over the next hour, Howard and his friends shared stories passed down through generations about Blackwater Creek. According to local law, the creek had never run dry before European settlement. The Lenape considered it sacred, believing it connected to underground rivers that led to the spirit world. When the first settlers came, they tried to redirect the creek for their mills, Howard explained. That first winter, nearly half the settlement died of mysterious illnesses. The survivors blamed it on something they'd disturbed in the creek. The Drought Walker, one of the other men, introduced as Bill, interjected. Howard shot him a warning look. but continued. The settlement relocated further downstream, leaving that section of land untouched for decades. Then came the Wilsons in the 1870s. Thomas Wilson was an educated man, didn't believe in superstitions. He built that dam in 1893 during another drought to create a reservoir. And they abandoned the farm the next year, I said, recalling Dr. Harper's information. Howard nodded. Left in the middle of the night, according to my grandfather. Thomas Wilson came into town raving about something that walked the creek bed at night, looking for the water he'd stolen. Every owner since has had troubles during droughts, Bill added. Some worse than others. Your daddy was smart. He never interfered with what was left of the creek. Just farmed the upper fields, left the creek bed and woods alone. I described the entity I'd been seeing, the wet footsteps, its appearance at my window. The old men didn't seem surprised or disbelieving. It's getting bolder, Howard said grimly. This drought's the worst in living memory. That thing, whatever it is, must be desperate. Has anyone ever tried to, I don't know, help it? Restore the creek? Walter Jenkins tried in the 60s, Bill said. Demolished part of the old dam, tried to reroute the water back to its original course. Place was abandoned after that. He disappeared one night during a storm. They found his body in the creek bed weeks later, completely dry despite the rain. Like something had drained every drop of moisture from him. I felt sick. So this thing is dangerous. Only to those who try to interfere with it, Howard said. It wants the creek restored, but on its terms, not ours. Best to just wait out the drought, son. Once the rains come, it'll go dormant again. And if the rains don't come, climate change is making these droughts more frequent, more severe. The old men had no answer for that. When I returned to the records office, Beverly had assembled a substantial collection of materials, maps, deeds, water rights documents, even old newspaper clippings. I spent hours going through them, piecing together a more complete history of Blackwater Creek and my property. The original creek had indeed followed a different course, with multiple springs feeding it from the ravine I'd explored. The Wilson Dam had effectively cut off these springs from the main channel, redirecting the water. Subsequent owners had further altered the landscape, installing drainage tiles in the 1920s that lowered the water table even more. What struck me most was a pattern in ownership changes. Every time there was a severe drought, the property changed hands shortly afterward. The timing was too consistent to be coincidence. As I was preparing to leave, Beverly handed me one final folder. Found this in the restricted archives. It's a case file from the Sheriff's Department, 1967, the Jenkins disappearance. It was never officially closed. The file contained investigation notes, photographs, and interview transcripts. Walter Jenkins had indeed attempted to restore Blackwater Creek to its original course, removing portions of the Wilson Dam and digging out channels that had silted in over decades. According to his wife's statement, Jenkins had been experiencing phenomena similar to what I'd been witnessing, footsteps at night, a tall figure seen near the creek bed. But unlike me, Jenkins had interpreted these as signs of approval. He believed the entity was guiding his restoration efforts. The night he disappeared, a sudden localized storm had hit Creek Farm, a downpour that affected only his property, according to weather records. Jenkins had rushed out to see if his work was holding up under the rainfall. His wife reported hearing a terrible scream, followed by silence. When authorities found his body 3 weeks later, the medical examiner's report noted something disturbing. Jenkins's body contained almost no water. It wasn't decomposed or desiccated in the normal sense. Rather, it was described as completely dehydrated, as though every drop of moisture had been systematically extracted. The cause of death was listed as unexplained. I drove back to the farm with a growing sense of dread. The entity, the drought walker, was not simply a displaced spirit. It was something potentially lethal, something that had killed before. As I pulled into the driveway, fat raindrops began to hit my windshield. Within seconds, it became a downpour so intense I could barely see through the glass. Lightning flashed, illuminating the farm in stark white light. And there, standing in the middle of the yard, was the entity. In the rain, it seemed more substantial, more physical. Water streamed down its black form, pooling at its feet. It was facing the house, facing me, its featureless head tilted slightly upward. I remained in the car, engine running, too terrified to move. The entity stood motionless in the deluge for several minutes. Then slowly, it turned and walked toward the dried creek bed, disappearing into the darkness. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the farm wet and glistening in the evening light. I cautiously exited the car and examined the ground where the entity had stood. The rain had indeed fallen, everything was wet, but when I checked the weather radar on my phone, there was no storm system anywhere near Millfield. The entity had created the rainfall somehow, and it had wanted me to see it. That night, I barricaded myself in the bedroom, pushing a heavy dresser against the door. I didn't expect it to actually stop the entity if it wanted to enter, but it gave me some small comfort. I kept the lights on and tried to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually overcame me. I awoke to wet footsteps, not in the hallway or kitchen, but in my room. My eyes snapped open to see the entity standing at the foot of my bed, water dripping steadily from its form onto the hardwood floor. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The entity leaned forward, its featureless face hovering just feet from mine. Then it raised one long arm and pointed, not at me, but toward the window. Fighting my terror, I turned to look. Through the window, I could see the creek bed illuminated by moonlight. For a moment, nothing seemed amiss. Then I noticed movement, water, a trickle at first, then stronger, flowing through the long, dry channel. I looked back at the entity, which remained pointing. Its message seemed clear. It wanted me to see the water's return. Then as I watched, it simply faded away, like mist dissipating in sunlight. When morning came, I rushed outside to examine the creek. The channel contained water, not much, just a small stream, but definitely flowing. I followed it to its source, the ravine where I'd found the spring. There, water bubbled up from the ground, cool and clear. The drought hadn't broken. The weather remained hot and dry. This water had another source, one I couldn't explain, and somehow I knew the entity had created it. Over the next few days, the water in Blackwater Creek steadily increased. What had been a trickle became a substantial stream, flowing along the original creek bed that had been dry for decades. The water bypassed the Wilson Dam entirely, finding a new path that somehow matched the course shown on the pre-1893 maps. The local news reported it as a miracle and a mystery, a single creek flowing during the worst drought in recorded history. Geologists and hydrologists descended on the area, setting up monitoring equipment and taking samples. Their preliminary findings only deepened the mystery. The water was unusually pure, with mineral content that matched no known local source. The entity continued to appear nightly, but its behavior had changed. Instead of pacing restlessly, it now stood at various points along the creek, as though guarding or observing the water's flow. It no longer entered the house. I kept my distance, watching from windows or the porch. Despite the scientific activity during daylight hours, no one else reported seeing the entity. It remained visible only to me. One evening, a week after the creek's mysterious revival, Howard Jennings appeared at my door. Accompanied by an elderly Native American man he introduced as Joseph Redhawk. Joseph's grandfather was Lenape, Howard explained. His family never left the area when the others were forced west. He knows the old stories better than anyone. Joseph was direct. "You've seen the Water Keeper." The name sent a chill through me. The tall black figure. "Yes, I've been seeing it for weeks." Joseph nodded gravely. "It is very old, from before my people came to these lands. It belongs to the water, not just any water, but this specific waterway. Joseph explained that the Waterkeeper was a guardian spirit bound to Blackwater Creek for millennia. When settlers dammed and diverted the creek, they trapped the entity in a diminished form. During droughts, it would emerge, desperately searching for its water. "It's not evil," Joseph said, "but it's not human either. It doesn't understand us. It only knows its purpose, to protect the water." "Then why did it kill Walter Jenkins?" I asked. "He was trying to restore the creek." Joseph shook his head. "The Waterkeeper doesn't want human interference. The water must return naturally, or through its own power," Howard added grimly. "Jenkins made the mistake of trying to control it. The Waterkeeper took his body's water as punishment." Before leaving, Joseph warned me, "It's showing you the water's return as a gift. But be careful. Drought or no drought, it's still dangerous. It exists to protect the water, not people." The next morning, I woke to dark clouds gathering, despite forecasts of continued drought. The newly flowing creek had swelled overnight, now rushing with force. The entity had somehow conjured this water, creating its own solution to the drought. Scientists were baffled. News crews arrived, reporting on the Millfield miracle. Through it all, the Waterkeeper remained invisible to everyone but me. That night, as rain finally began to fall across the region, I ventured to the creek. The entity stood in the center of the now substantial flow, water cascading around its black form. "Thank you for bringing the water back," I said, keeping a safe distance. The entity turned toward me. For the first time, I noticed features forming in its face, hollow depressions where eyes might be, a vertical slit suggesting a mouth. It raised one impossibly long arm and pointed upstream toward the ruined dam. Understanding dawned on me. You want the dam completely removed. You want the creek fully restored. The entity lowered its arm and nodded, a single, deliberate motion. Over the next day, as rain continued to fall, I contacted authorities about removing the remains of the Wilson Dam, citing historical records and environmental concerns. The drought was breaking across the region, but I felt an urgency to complete what the Waterkeeper wanted. That night, a massive storm hit. Lightning struck repeatedly near the old dam while the entity paced the property's boundaries. I watched from the house as water rose rapidly in the creek, threatening to flood. Around midnight, I heard a tremendous crack. The old dam had finally collapsed completely under the force of the water. The creek surged forward, reclaiming its original path. The house shook with the force of the storm. Wind howled, rain lashed the windows, and through it all I could hear something else, a sound like rushing water, but deeper, more primordial. The Waterkeeper was changing. By morning, the storm had passed. Blackwater Creek now followed its original course perfectly, flowing strong and clear. The drought had broken, but something else had changed too. The Waterkeeper appeared to me one final time, standing in the middle of the restored creek. Its form had transformed, still tall and black, but now fluid, like animated water rather than a solid shadow. Its features were more defined, its presence less menacing. It raised both arms in what seemed like a gesture of gratitude, then slowly merged with the flowing water, dissolving until nothing remained but the natural movement of the creek. In the months that followed, I researched water restoration and ecology, eventually establishing the Blackwater Creek Conservation Trust. The property became a protected watershed, ensuring the creek would never again be dammed or diverted. Sometimes, during heavy rains, I still hear wet footsteps circling the house. Not threatening anymore, just checking, making sure its water remains protected. And on particularly still nights, if I watch the creek long enough, I occasionally glimpse a tall, fluid shadow moving with the current, guarding its domain. The Waterkeeper never truly left. It's part of the creek now, as it always should have been. And as long as the water flows freely, it remains peaceful, a guardian rather than a haunting presence. I've come to understand that not all terrors stem from malevolence. Sometimes they arise from desperation, from being cut off from what sustains us. The entity that once filled me with dread now fills me with a strange sense of responsibility to protect this land, this water, this ancient relationship between spirit and place. The locals have accepted me now, sharing more stories about the creek and its guardian. They no longer fear Creek Farm. Instead, they respect it as a place where the ancient and modern worlds maintain a careful balance. As for me, I found an unexpected peace here. The divorce, my father's death, my former life all seem distant now. I've become the keeper of more than just a farm. I'm the steward of something ancient, something that will continue long after I'm gone. And each night, as I drift off to sleep, I listen for those wet footsteps, not with fear, but with reassurance. The waterkeeper walks its restored domain, and all is as it should be.